I would like to express my thanks to Mail Media for the invitation. It's a great honor to be here, to be with all the distinguished guests here. What I'd like to share with you are some thoughts I have about RCEP and China's new strategy in dealing with a very changed world. But the view expressed here are my own, and they are not reflection of either of my current or previous employer, nor are they anything related to the Chinese government. I'm just a professor. The changes that's occurring in the world in the last 40 years has been quite dramatic. First, we have seen globalization, a process in which of very deep economic integration around the world because of all the liberal policies that implemented by many governments, including Korean governments, Chinese governments, as well as, I think most importantly, US government, and also by multilateral institutions such as the WTO, IMF and World Bank. They're all pushing for, previously we have known this for the Washington Consensus. And in that sort of liberal economic integration, many things have changed, right? The most important thing that we recognize is the rise of Asian economies. First, Japan, and then quickly followed by Korea, the Taiwan province of China, Hong Kong, and Singapore. And then soon followed by the ASEAN countries, and then followed by China. And of course, China surpassed ASEAN countries in economic development. And now it looks like the ASEAN countries are going to be the next one for rapid economic development. So this unprecedented global economic development brought about a huge increase in income around the world, right? And it actually literally brought billions of people out of poverty, most importantly in China. I would consider China more than half of the population before the economic reforms and opening up were living under poverty, and many often that are under, I would call it the abject poverty, right? So this is a huge increase in prosperity around the world. And this, of course, was followed by the rapid industrialization of China and the global value chain that's being reorganized around the world, around primarily three economies. And most importantly, China, and then United States and Germany. And each one of these three countries sort of have regional integration as well. And so this is becoming very apparent. But then because of that, right, and also because of all the changes in rapid increase in wealth, there's lots of discontent with what had happened. In particular, right, we're now worried about income inequality. Most of the worry about income inequality occur locally. We're worried about inequality in China. We're worried about inequality in Korea. We're worried about particularly inequality in the United States. But if you look globally, paradoxically, inequality has been in the decline, right? This globalization has brought down a huge reduction in global inequality, which literally means inequality between countries, right? But locally, inequality all risen. And of course, if you think more closely, you realize that there's an old American saying that all politics is local. But as local inequality rises, it creates conditions where even though the inequality per se is not a cause for revolution, but always is a rally point where the elites seize the moment and then think about how we can rally the troops and to do some change, right? So that's what happens, we see around the world, right? the elites are easily finding out that their agendas are easy sales and so on and so forth. And so this has given rise to what we have today, right? We have lots of global discontent. There are policy adjustments every country. And of course, globally, we've dealt with decoupling and then realizing decoupling is not working. And now we're de-risking and then realizing de-risking is also very costly. So it's probably some sort of a re-globalization. But what do we mean by that re-globalization? So that's something that we probably need to take a look. And that's probably something more local and more regional, but still that needs to be a multilateral engagement. So with that, I'd like to show you some of the data. What's really interesting is the rapid increase in share of Chinese manufacturing in the global share, whether they are measured in value-added basis or the growth basis. The growth basis is more apparent, but even in value-added basis, you see a large changes in the rise of Chinese share in the global manufacturing. And so this is something that a key to what I would call the industrialization 3.0. And but if you take a look of the global supply chain, right? The global supply chain was really interesting. It's organized also regionally. And what you see is here is on the top left corner is the North American bloc, where you have United States, Canada, and Mexico. In the middle, you have the European bloc, which consists of Germany, Great Britain, France, and Italy. And then in the lower right corner, you have the Asian bloc. We have China, Japan, Korea, and India, to lesser extent India in that bloc. But what's really interesting is that there are two countries that stand out very prominently. One is China, another is US, right? Almost every country rely heavily on China as a source of intermediate inputs, changing color around China. So for every lumber, right, it's the column country's total usage or purchase of intermediate inputs from row country. So a lumber here is Korean purchase of Britain's intermediate inputs. All right. So here is the Korean purchase of Chinese inputs as a total. So 7 is very, so Korea is very dependent on China for inputs. Mexico is also, and even the United States. And also US is also very, this row is also very dark. So US is also an important global supplier of intermediate inputs. What's really interesting is the change from 1995 to 2018, right? And China has risen sharply. And many other countries are reducing. And what's really interesting, for most countries, you can see, they are sourcing less and less domestically. And this is what we call the globalization, which is the outsourcing of inputs from other countries. And China has positioned itself prominently globally as the center of a supply chain. So as a result, I think we moving forward, I think this is the time to think about if truly global integration is now in question, are there alternatives, right? And clearly we're going back to autarky or regional autarky is not an option because it's going to be very costly. And what's the alternative? The alternative, it turns out that it could be more of a making use of a regional free trade agreement such as RCEP. So RCEP now all of a sudden become very important. So RCEP was conceived in 2011 by ASEAN countries. As you can see from here, ASEAN countries are here. They're in the light blue. They're sandwiched between, on the top, which is in the north, China, Korea, and Japan. And to the south, which is Australia and New Zealand. It's roughly within a 3 to 4 time zone region, which makes communication much easier. You don't have to wait until the evening to make a phone call, right? So this trade pact was signed in 2020, but then become effective, get implemented on January 1st, 2022. What's really interesting in here is that this is the first free trade agreement actually fully includes China, Japan, and Korea. The 3 large Asian giants. China and Korea has a free trade agreement, but neither China nor Korea has any free trade agreement with Japan. So this is an interesting one you can have. So all 3 large giants gets integrated into something that's ASEAN countries are forming together, which is very interesting. So this is agreements, of course, include many of the typical free trade agreements, and so I will not spending too much time on, but I'd like to talk about a little bit about special features, which I think is important. First of all, let's do some quick overview about this. This is the largest regional free trade agreement, it occurs roughly, it covers roughly 1/3 of the world population and also 30% of the global GDP. So it's literally about 30% of the global, both population as well as income. And what's really interesting is here is that this agreement is between, you can think about Australia and New Zealand as a supplier of raw material and agricultural products. Then you have ASEAN countries who are in the lower end of manufacturing, but also lots of raw material. And you have these 3 industrial giants. And it looks like a funnel where the raw material gets moved up and gets made into final products, then recycled within the region and also exported to the rest of the world. And so this is something which is very much a production optimized free trade area where it has almost all the inputs you need and almost all the technology you need for making anything you want. What's really neat to be in this free trade agreement is economies that has high demand, which is really interesting. And I think, and this is going to be something all the member countries need to work out and how they can boost up consumption rather than simply production in this region. And what's really interesting is that even though China is very close to all the economies geographically, the Chinese exports and imports are not very dependent on other RCEP member economies. You can see that here. Chinese imports and exports from and to RCEP regions is less than 40%. Japan is also close to 50%, and China is significantly lower. So China has been integrated more towards European and American economy than to the regional economy, as you can see. So there is a large shift, therefore, that could be very beneficial, both to China and then to the neighboring countries where when Chinese manufacturing capability as well as assets are moved into surrounding economies. So the free trade agreements, the typical promise that you would cut down your tariffs, which we call the tariff concessions. We can see here as well. China is here, Korea is here, and all ASEAN countries are here. So every country promised they would reduce their tariffs for the product lines they promise to liberalize. But there are also product lines that are they are not committed to lower the tariff rates. And so let's talk about some of the features that are less usual. What's really interesting is what you can see is the three large East Asian economies, China, Japan, and Korea, that before the RCEP, there are several of these lines of products that's quite significant. For Japan, it's about 20%. For China, it's about 28%, and Korea is 29%. So they are excluded. There are not non-zero tariffs, right? And it is here where the countries promise to reduce tariff, right? So the percentage of line of tariff reduction for these three East Asian economies are significantly higher than the ASEAN countries. Looking at these, many of you probably can guess what products these are. Mostly they are agriculture, and they are also related to things like we all consider very important, like car manufacturing, and they are tariff protected. And if you're complaining about, if we're all complaining about going to grocery stores, finding groceries expensive and sent to the tariff, right? But if you're a farmer, you would like to maintain those high tariffs. So this is all the local economies have their own local political interests that are driving many of the multilateral negotiations. So here again, highlight some of the features of the RCEP agreement that's different from others. Usually a free trade agreement would negotiate and to make it non-discriminatory. Non-discriminatory is not an Asian kind of concept, right? So as a result, it's reflected in here is that we're going to discriminate, right? We're going to have differences for when we look at different countries. And when we liberalize, and we can see for some country we're going to liberalize, for others we're going to put on more protection. So these are something like that. What you can see is here. Table shows the percent of uncommitted, right, where these are the sectors or product lines that are not going to see any tariff reduction. Right, they're going to be protected. And also what's interesting is that some of the tariff protections are going to be maintained vis-a-vis these three large Asian economies. But they're going to be opened up for other countries, like the ASEAN and Australia and New Zealand. So that's what's so interesting. You can see this, whatever in this box, and the number is high. So going on forward, I think the three large Asian economies, we call the three East Asian giants, probably needs to think about ways where we could make more liberalization across board. But currently, within the RCEP, there's going to be more protected against each other. And also that for tariff reductions, even for the sectors that are committed to liberalize, the tariff reductions among the three giants are also less. So they're going to make less sort of a tariff reduction. But they're going to offer more tariff reduction to other countries. This is a very interesting feature of the RCEP agreement within the, in particular, if you're taking from the perspective of one of the three giants. So there are value chain linkages among all the economies, but the three giants. Good example of trade liberalization, in fact, with RCEP is that, let's take an example of, this is coming from a study done by other authors that were written in 2022. You take a look of the supply chain from parts of laser, making laser products, and then moves into Korea for further processing, and then with the final product sold to China, where you can see there, before the RCEP, there would be a 8% tariff moving from Japan to Korea. And then if that product qualifies for Korea-China free trade agreement, then that components moving from Korea to China would be subject to 2.4% tariff. If not, then it would be subject to 6% tariff, right? So, but within the RCEP region, after RCEP, the effective reduction, all that is going to be reduced to zero. There will be no tariff. That moving from Japan to Korea and then to China with no tariff added. So that's one of the reasons why we economists think that this is going to create more jobs as well as more innovation, because this would allow different manufacturers to specialize, right? They could increase their sales, and both the Japanese and Korean Chinese manufacturers can specialize in things they do best, and relying on others to produce the things that they can't produce cheaply or couldn't do better. And this is, and also that with zero tariff, the combined supply chain would be a lot more competitive globally. So that would take away markets from maybe American or European manufacturers. So we would call this trade diversion. That trade that would occur resulting in exports from the United States or from Europe, then would be not be able to compete against the Asian supply chain. So that's sort of the trade diversion part of that deal. And all that is going to generate a significant gain for countries within the RCEP agreement area. As a result, economists tend to think about statically how much of these gains are going to be. Usually the gains are pretty small, right? You can think about the statically, when you consider tariffs alone, you just reduce tariff, and that effect is going to be 0.07%. That's pretty small. But then if you think about, in addition to tariff reduction, there are also going to be liberalization of non-tariff restrictions. And then that raised the gain to about 20.21%. That's still small. But then you consider these, what we call the ROO, or the rule of origin liberalization, that then would raise it to about 0.5%. But it's still small. And then you consider the dynamic impact. The dynamic impact is when you consider when people realize there's going to be zero tariff, then people are going to start specialize. People are going to invest more. And then the gains from that specialization and from increased competition is going to raise what we call the productivity cake, is going to raise the gain to about 2.45%. And then that's become quite significant. And think about that's just an increase in productivity by 2.5%. It could be quite substantial for economy as large as Japan, Korea, and China. And also, what we are really concerned to many other countries outside our RCEP region, they're concerned about the trade diversion. What if you're become more competitive? Then Americans and Europeans won't be able to compete. And the impact on them are largely small. The negative impact is very small, but they could also benefit from these productivity cake. So in general, I think this is a win-win situation for everyone involved. And this is based on World Bank estimates using the envisage model. And then you think about what are the countries that stand to benefit the most. As it turns out, the countries on a percentage base stand to benefit the most are Vietnam and Malaysia. And you can imagine why, because they are at the level of economic development, they are perfectly positioned to take some of the lower, in the case of Vietnam, the middle tier of manufacturing capacity, which is Malaysia, from the three Asian giants, mostly importantly from China. So the Chinese productive capacity, some of that is going to move into these two economies, and so they are the ones stands to benefit quite a bit. But even though others are small, but only in percentage-wise. Again, this is based on the World Bank estimates. Part of the productivity cake comes from investments, which we call the dynamic part of the gain from this free trade agreement. The inward FDI flows to ASEAN countries are going to accelerate sharply. And now what's really interesting, you would think that it's going to be the three Asian giants investing in ASEAN countries. The answer actually is no. At least in the beginning of the phase, it's going to be United States and EU countries that are actually moving into ASEAN countries. And the reason is because they themselves want to move some of their invested capacity in China into ASEAN countries. And so they are moving some capacity from China to these countries. And then, of course, the Chinese are also doing that, right? So it's going to be EU, it's going to be US, EU, and then followed by China in moving some of the investments directly into the ASEAN countries. So this is going to be a quite significant development for many of these smaller economies in Southeast Asian countries because they're not used to receiving so much investments in manufacturing capacity, which is really an interesting part. In many cases, in some of the, we call it the industrial zones, the price of land and rents has risen significantly because of the large inflow of FDI. And so that's going to put a damper on it temporarily so that going to increase the process into a longer period of time because and as you move in there, you want to avoid a certain surge in land price and other input prices. What's really interesting is Singapore is taking a large share. Part of the reason is that many countries are investing first in Singapore and then using the Singapore company as an investment for ASEAN countries. So Singapore taking a role of a middleman. So you can think about Chinese companies establish a Singapore subsidiary and then using the Singapore subsidiary to invest in Vietnam. And that's one of the things you can see this capital flow to Singapore first, and then from Singapore to other countries. So China is now diversifying its manufacturing base into Southeast Asia, quite substantial way. And then you can see from here, investment in ASEAN countries and 24 billion FDI in manufacturing. So this is a significant increase for Chinese going global. China, Japan, and Korea are kind of culturally very similar in a way that they are less willing to invest in other countries. For the Japanese, investing outside Japan occurred starting in the 1980s and 90s in response to American tariff, Japan-US trade relations. And then China is doing the same thing, right? And if you think more about it, then you might ask, why don't they do it earlier? Before they got into sort of trade disputes with the United States. But that's always the case because I think for East Asian mindset is we tend to think more, let's get the investment in the home first and think about exports primarily, right? Rather than going outside our comfort zone to make investments. We're not we're not used to this colonial type of expansion. We're more interested in, if we have good products, let's export them to other countries rather than build a beachfront and then put down some productive capacity and hiring local workers to make those products. So that's something that we tend not to do or to do more. And now the Chinese are facing what the Japanese faced in 1980s and 1990s, and think about that we're trying to do catch up, and as you can see is here. And as always, when you're doing these massive movements of capital, you make mistakes, right? When the Japanese made lots of investment in the 1980s and 1990s, there are lots of cases about how poorly they manage those overseas investments. And I'm sure 5 or 10 years from now, there's going to be lots of stories about how the Chinese mismanage their investments. It's a learning process, right? As you go to another country and you have to learn their local culture and so on and so forth, it's not so easy, right? So that's something that we're going to see more of, and then we're going to see many Chinese companies pay what we call tuition to learn. And this is all part of the process of re-globalization. Currently, the Chinese are very strong in certain fields, in particular in the battery-operated electric vehicle arena. And the Chinese, many of the Chinese BEV supply chains are now moving very quickly into Southeast Asia. You see BYD making investments both in Thailand and Vietnam, and quite significantly. And they're also selling their cars there, first by exporting and see how the market responds, and now putting plants in there and manufacturing. The company that's really scared is Toyota and Honda, where they have large presence in Southeast Asian countries, and now they are in a panic mode. CATL is making EV batteries, which is power batteries also, and in Indonesia. Part of the reason Indonesia is because, number one, the Indonesian market itself is large, right? It's a huge population. But what's really important is for battery EVs is that Indonesia also supplies many of the key ingredients for making battery. So it's both sources of supply and also a large market for the battery. As you can see, the Chinese brands now dominates the BEV market. New car registration, the top 3 are all the Chinese manufacturers. And then the number 4 is Tesla. So this is quite an extraordinary development. But still, this is not a point for many traditional car manufacturer to panic, because the BEV is still a small proportion of the total market, which we see in the next. So EV still represents only 4% of all light vehicles in ASEAN countries. And you can imagine why, because ASEAN countries usually have very low gas price, right? Gasoline price or petroleum or petrol price. Is much lower in those countries than other countries. And so their electricity might actually be high. So operating BEV may not represent a huge saving on the side of the consumer. So and people are now being more interested in looking at the total car ownership and total operating cost of a car, rather than simply, I like EV and so on and so forth. In China, it's a different story, where the electricity is cheap, much cheaper than gasoline. So operating a EV car is much more economical, in particular for taxi drivers and so on and so forth. So then we think about the sort of a re-globalization, and what does that mean? One of the things I think about is that despite all the geopolitical tensions, the global trade and the GDP continue to grow. And we can see both 2003, which we see a reduction in merchandise trade, but going on to this year, the forecast, the prediction is that both GDP as well as trade are continue going to grow. And also the forecast for 2025, growth in trade is actually going to lead the growth in income, in GDP. So this is something that we worry that the repeat of 2003 is going to happen, but it doesn't look that way. I think we are now making adjustments, how we live in a new world. So one of the adjustments is that, as you can see here, is that the trade of United States and China with each other, which is the blue line. You can see this large decrease after the 2018 tariff on China, the Trump tariff. And then, of course, there's the trade is affected by COVID, and there's a recovery from COVID. And then there's a war in Ukraine. Russian invasion of Ukraine then made the relations between China and the U.S. worse. And you can see, again, a decline in the direct trade between China and the United States. But you look behind the numbers, even though the direct trade between China and the United States is lower, but then you ask, U.S. still buying a lot of inputs. Where these inputs come from, right? And you ask, what is the value added behind all those inputs? Then you realize that many of these components are still made in China, right? So, and once you figure into that, the trade of United States and China with other partners, right? And you can see it's still quite robust. U.S. remains one of the largest demander, or what they call consumer markets in many categories. And of course, in some categories, now China is the largest world market. For example, cars. But for many others, clothing and so on and so forth, the U.S. is still the largest market. Up through 2023, which we have the data from last year, the Chinese trade keeps on growing until about 2022 and 2023, you see a reduction, but we expect 2024 a recovery. But most of these trade were carried by private company in China, as well as foreign invested company. And then the red are the state-owned company. They take a very small portion. As the U.S. reduces imports from China, other countries are taking up, right? You can see the U.S. is importing less from China, but is importing more from Mexico as well as Vietnam. And you say, who's behind that increase in Mexico and Vietnam? That's China, right? And it's literally goods mostly manufactured that are moved from China to Vietnam, and then with some manufacturing on it, and then exported to the United States. So that's labeled as made in Vietnam. And of course, U.S. sees through this and now begin to levy tariff on Vietnam because of that. And then, of course, there's going to be more into Malaysia and other Asian countries. And so this is going to be a very complicated game that we're going to see going on. So China value-added share as ASEAN countries' exports continue to rise. So for many countries' exports, Chinese share of the value-added is rising sharply after 2018. You can see from this data. Like Vietnam in particular. That's one of the reasons why U.S. singled out Vietnam for tariff action. So excluding the tariff product, China's high-tech export to United States have actually grown. Right? This is Chinese exports as percent of Chinese GDP. Well, as the economy grew large, like China, trade become less important. So in general, you see a declining portion of trade as percent of the GDP. But for these non-tariff products, which the U.S. did not put a tariff on, for example, DJI's drones, and those are continue to sell very well in the United States. And now the Chinese government says, maybe we should restrict that. So they put a ban on sales of drones made in China in the U.S., which is a very interesting development. So Chinese, I won't be spending time on Chinese outlook. Everybody's concerned about China. Is China collapsing? And my answer is, I have some data here. China is going through a crisis right now, which is nothing to do with trade or with American action. had everything to do with a housing bubble bursting. And can China solve the problem? And my sense is that China has dealt with a much worse problem before. And if we go back in history, look at the time between 2003, 2008, China has an even worse crisis. And that crisis resulted in Chinese state-owned banks non-performing loan ratio to reach 25%. And all the banks, state-owned banks, are literally bankrupt. But if you dig deeper, you realize the 25% is actually too lenient. If you apply more stringent standards, the non-performing loan ratio is actually 45%. So that's a very sharp financial and economic crisis that occurred in China. And of course, we don't realize that China had that crisis. That's because none of those banks were listed in the stock market. And then China, of course, solved the problem and using a similar, what we call the quantitative easing. And I think China is capable of doing that again. But the Chinese government is very reluctant to do so. You may ask me why. And then my answer is, I don't know. If it were me, I would have done QE a long time ago. But the Chinese government is currently very conservative. They don't want to print money. They worry about too much monetary expansion, which is very odd. And this is the time not to worry about monetary expansion. This is the time to worry about deflation. But it's not for me to judge. So I'm just here to make comments. And again, I thank you for your attention. And everything I said here is just my own opinion. And thank you so much.